up on our I'm just hitting record now just so we can kind of like, you know, get on with it here. I'm gonna then spotlight us. Oh, Kynan, I see you're home. I guess you didn't you got home in time from
I
school
did.
today?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Jose Vega. I work with Diane on her campaign. I've been around with the Schiller Institute now for almost like since I was like 15 years old. Go ahead, Kynan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I've been involved with the Schiller Institute for about 3 years. I'm 20 years old now, and I go to Hunter College. And I also did some work with Diane's campaign, and I heavily admire you for your work, Scott, and all the various articles that you've been putting out. So yeah, hopefully it'll be a fun conversation.
I'm looking forward to it.
So, let's just get started with the very basics. Scott, I think a lot of people are always looking to you today for a kind of on the spot analysis of like what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Russia. But let's take a step back for a minute and say, what, why are you an expert in the current affairs today? Can you tell me a little bit about your role as a UN weapons inspector? And what does that mean exactly?
Well, I think even before we talk about the UN weapons inspector, the reason why I don't want to jump forward to that is because it's literally jumping over, a tremendous part of the thing. If you look at my resume, you say UN weapons inspector. What does that mean? Weapons of mass destruction, Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons, missiles. And then you look at my background. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a nuclear science, a physicist, and not a rocket scientist either. I'm a beer drinking, football playing history major. That's it. That's as simple as it gets. I don't pretend to be anything other than that. So why would a beer drinking, football playing history major suddenly be put in a position where he's running weapons of mass destruction inspections in Iraq? And to understand that, you have to go back to my beer drinking, football playing times in college. I was a child of the Cold War. My dad was a career Air Force officer, and we were raised, sisters and I were raised all over the world. I think our formative years were in Hawaii, Turkey, and Germany. I went to high school in each one of those locations. My dad served in Vietnam, so there's the whole anti-communist aspect to this childhood. The Cold War was real. We lived in Turkey in the 1970s. Our schoolmates' fathers all had really interesting jobs, like monitoring Soviet nuclear tests at a seismic station outside of Ankara, Turkey, intercepting Soviet communications at a top secret SIGINT intercept site in Sinop. And we can just go on and on and on. It was just one of these weird places that you only read about in obscure spy novels, but it was real. It was Turkey during the Cold War. Then we went to Germany, and it stopped being a spy novel and it started being a war novel. In the little town of Charlottenbach that we lived in outside of Kaiserslautern, in the first winter I was there, they were holding major exercises, and literally you had American tanks and armored vehicles crawling through the farmers' fields and in the forests, because our village happened to be in the last line of defense that the United States was going to be mounting if the Soviets decided to come across the border. The border, which, by the way, was just 80 kilometers that direction, where the First Guards Tank Army was waiting with 100,000 men to come across. This was real. There were airplanes flying in the sky, helicopters flying in the sky, armored vehicles everywhere. We lived next door to a place called North Point. It's a nuclear weapons storage facility. And if there was going to be a war, that would be one of the first places hit, which means my home was literally ground zero for the future conflict. And ground zero meant my family and I were dead. It's that simple. That was the reality, not theory. This isn't something that we thought about. There was a book in the 1960s called Alas, Babylon, and it was a book about the end of the world, nuclear war between the United States and then the Soviet Union. And Alas, Babylon was the code phrase that this fictional Air Force officer would call up his wife and say, Alas, Babylon. It meant the missiles are flying, hit the kids, and do whatever you need to do. The world's going to end. My dad used that same phrase, and there were a couple times in the 1970s where he had to go down into the nuclear bunker because of an impending crisis, and he would call my mom and say Alas Babylon, because we thought it was it. So that was my childhood. And so when I went to college, after graduating high school, I was singularly focused on being in a position that if the Russians ever came across the border in Europe, I would be right there on the front line to kill them. Kill a commie for mommy wasn't just a cute little saying that we joke about today. It was real. Better dead than red? Oh, you're damn right. The communist threat was the real threat. It was evil, and I was going to be right there to do it. So in college, I studied Russian. I went to college specifically to study Russian language, Russian history, Russian culture, not because I was enthralled with them. I wanted to kill them. But in order to better kill your enemy, you have to know your enemy. You have to know how they think. You have to be able to anticipate their actions. You have to be able to read their newspapers, read their doctrine in their original language, so you don't miss any nuance that might escape translation. And I did that. And but I ain't no PhD student. I mean, I was a good student. I studied hard, and I learned a lot. But I graduated with honors in history, so I absorbed it. But I'm not trying to sit here and say that I was somebody special. Trust me, I was just your average beer drinking football player in college. That's it. I graduated, got my commission in the Marine Corps, and went off to do Marine stuff, which included serving for my first 2.5 years of my Marine career in 29 Palms, California, which is the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center, the largest live fire training base in the United States. And I was with a field artillery unit, nuclear capable, by the way, just to show you that this is real. We practiced firing nuclear rounds, simulated nuclear rounds, so that when the time came in combat, we would fire it without any question or without any errors towards the enemy. We were ready to fire a nuke that quick. We're also prepared to kill the enemy. And I spent 2.5 years doing just that, perfecting the art of war from a field artillery perspective, so that if we ever had to engage the Soviet threat, we would prevail. And I thought that was going to be my career trajectory. I finished my time in the field artillery, and I had received orders to a special operations capable expeditionary unit. And I was just happier than a clam in mud. But then, darn it, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev sat down in December of 1987, and they signed this treaty called the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. See, while I was off practicing to kill Russians in Europe, the United States and Russia were getting ready to kill each other in a very organized fashion with these weapons we call intermediate nuclear forces. For the Russians, it's centered around this missile called the SS-20. It's a road mobile missile. It had 3 nuclear warheads, and they had hundreds of them. And basically, when they fielded this weapon in the late 1970s, it became Advantage Russia. They now had the ability to saturate Europe with nuclear warheads, just annihilating everything, and we had nothing to stop that. So the decision was made that we would have to deploy a counter, and we did this with something called the Ground Lost Cruise Missile, and then the Pershing II missile. There was big disruption in Europe during the early 1980s when this was being considered. The German people went out in the streets and actually brought down the government of Helmut Kohl, collapsed the government in protest over this. This was a big deal because the Europeans were saying, we don't want to turn Europe into a nuclear playground between the United States and the Soviet Union. We're not happy about this, but we did it anyways. Fortunately, after doing that, both sides came to their senses, but they did it in the most unconventional way. We almost went to nuclear war. You see, remember those exercises I was telling you about where we have the tanks outside my yard? Well, in 1983, they did an exercise called Able Archer 83. This is after we deployed tens of thousands of American troops from the United States to Germany, simulating the reinforcement that would take place if there was a conflict. After we deployed thousands of aircraft, and we basically were on a combat footing. And then we had the gall to do a command post exercise that tested NATO's nuclear release authorities. So we were front loaded for conventional war, and then we were testing NATO nuclear release procedures. Now, the Soviets, they have intelligence officers, and they were sitting there monitoring and saying, wait a minute, they just brought all these troops over. They got all these airplanes here. They're ready to go to war. And now they're practicing nuclear. They are getting ready for a preemptive nuclear strike against us. They're going to hit us with a surprise nuclear attack and then come in. So they mobilized those SS-20s, put them on a war footing, and ready to launch. They had aircraft on the runway with nuclear weapons strapped, ready to launch that quick. They believed we were going to nuke them. And if anything had happened during this exercise that led them to believe that it wasn't an exercise, it was real, you and I wouldn't be here today. The world would be over. And we came that close. Now, Reagan, when he was briefed on this a couple months later, someone said, the Soviets thought we were actually going to nuke them first. Reagan, why would they ever think that? They didn't really think that. And the CIA went, oh, yeah, they did. And they were getting ready for a nuclear war. And he went, that's insane. I know there's a lot of people out there that don't like Ronald Reagan, but I'm telling you right now, that's probably the best thing a president, anytime ever said. That's insane. Because then he acted on it. And he sat down and he signed a treaty to get rid of these weapons. Now, I'm sitting there getting ready to go off and do this, kill Russian thing. And unfortunately for me, or fortunately for me later on, the Pentagon was tasked with creating a unit that would carry out the inspections. Because there was nothing in the U.S. military that said on-site inspector. Didn't exist. They created a job for which we had no people qualified to do the job. And so we had to go out and select people. And they decided that the best person to do this job was an intelligence officer trained in Soviet area studies. We call them foreign area officers, FAOs. And we had them. These FAOs did really neat stuff. The fact is, when I joined the Marine Corps, became an intelligence officer, all I wanted to become is a Soviet FAO. Why? Because you get to go to Moscow as a defense attaché and spy. I don't mean play spy. I mean real spy. Go around, take photographs, draw up documents, do stuff. And you get to go to this place called Potsdam. It's outside of Berlin, East Berlin, something called the Military Liaison Mission. And you get to run around in souped up off-road vehicles and run around and spy on the Soviets legally. That's your job. Your job every morning is to get into a vehicle and drive around and escape the Russians, run around, take pictures, and then come back and come in. The coolest thing in the world if you're an intelligence officer. That's what I wanted to do. And we had a whole bunch of people who did it, who spoke the language. They went through the FAO program. That means they got a graduate degree in Russian area studies. They went and got specific language skills. Then they spent at least a year, sometimes two, at this place called the U.S. Army Russian Institute in Garmisch, Germany, up there in the beautiful Alps. And they had this village that they had populated with Russian emigres, and you would come in and you would live an immersive Russian language, Russian cultural experience, learning how to think like a Russian, speak like a Russian, act like a Russian, before going off and doing your jobs. These guys were the true experts. So the military said, those are the guys we want to be the on-site inspectors. We'll teach them how to do the missile stuff and all that, but we need Russian experts to do this. Unfortunately, we didn't have that many of these foreign area officers. And the Marine Corps was tasked with providing a certain number of them. And they started going down the ranks. And, Lieutenant Colonel, we got one, send them. Major, we don't have any. Captains, we don't have any. First lieutenants, we got Ritter. They're looking at my folder and it says, speaks Russian, Russian history. I played football. If you think I was fluent in Russian while I was drinking beer and playing football, I don't know what you're smoking. But no, I knew a little bit of Russian, but I wasn't fluent. But they're like, nope, speaks Russian. I did know Russian history. I'll give that to them. And so I went as a first lieutenant, joined this agency where all they wanted were majors. Majors were the junior guys, then lieutenant colonels, then colonels, and then a general was in command. I show up as a first lieutenant. Literally, this is a no joke. The first day I arrived there, a guy came up to me, he was a lieutenant colonel, and he looked at me and he said, hey, coffee machine's over there, get to work. Meaning my job is to get them coffee. Well, I'm a Marine officer. My job's not to get anybody coffee. But and I didn't. But but that's how they treated, because you're so junior. And they didn't know what to do with me. I showed up and they're just like, we don't know what to do with you. You have no skills. You're not a FAO. They tested me on the Russian language. They tried to get me on one of these inspection teams early on. And the lieutenant colonel in charge, of Marine Corps lieutenant colonel, came up to me and started wah, in Russian. They call him pulemyot. That's the Russian word for machine gun, because he speaks so fast. And he comes up and he locks me up. I'm a lieutenant. He's a colonel. I'm standing at attention. He's like, and I'm like, I have no clue what you're saying. He goes, you don't keep Russian worth a damn. I said, sir, I never said I did. He said, you're fired. Get out of here. We're kicking you out. So I lost my job literally on the first day. But fortunately, they kept me around because the Marine Corps didn't know how to receive me so quickly. And long story short, I ended up being put in charge of counterintelligence as a first lieutenant. Crazy. And I created a program that involved polygraphs of everybody who was going to go over to the Soviet Union because I was told that that's what you have to do. And when it came up to the general went, we ain't going to do this polygraph program. But because of the initiative I showed, I got put on this special team as a counterintelligence officer, even though I'm not one, that was going to send 30 people over to the Soviet Union outside of a missile factory to monitor their missile production to make sure they weren't producing the SS-20 missile, which was scheduled to construct under the treaty. And I ended up being, remember that colonel said, you're never going to show up in the Soviet Union? I ended up being the first inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union. How do you become an expert in something? There's a question people always ask. How did you become an expert? Be the first person to ever do it. When you're the first person to ever do it, you're the only person to ever do it. You're the expert. And everybody's looking to you. I was the first person on the ground in the Soviet Union for the implementation of the INF Treaty. And I was the first person to do everything that happened after that. I helped write the book on on-site inspection. And I actually wrote a book about this experience called Disarmament at the Time of Perestroika. And so I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but long story short, I came out of that with 2 classified commendations from the director of the CIA as a junior officer, unprecedented, unheard of, and a fantastic reputation as a guy who was serious about arms control and understood high-level negotiations between Russians and Americans, et cetera. I got a crash course in foreign area officer type work. In fact, when I left the agency, I was handpicked to be fast-tracked into the foreign area officer training track. Unfortunately for me, the war came. And now we come to part 2 of my career, the Gulf War. I ended up on the staff of General Schwarzkopf in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. My job was, one of my jobs was to track Iraqi Scud missiles. And early on in the conflict, I was confronted with the fact that while we knew the Iraqis had 19 launchers, we had reported we had killed over 60 of them. Now I'm a simple Marine and math's not my thing. But if there's only 19 and we killed 60, we have a problem. It means we're killing something that isn't a launcher. And since they keep launching the missiles at us, we're not killing the right things. So I got heavily involved in tracking down these missiles, working with the Air Force, working with Special Operations Forces to try and interdict these missiles. And I had what they call a good war, meaning I didn't get killed. It's always a good thing. And I did a good job. I came out with a good reputation as a Scud hunter. So, you have my experience with the INF Treaty, then you have my experience during the Gulf War. These are at very high levels. I'm saying, for a junior officer, my name was being floated at the highest levels in the United States in a good way, in a positive way. I left the Marine Corps after that because, to be honest, the Cold War was over and killing Russians was no longer the thing to do. Plus, I didn't want to kill them anymore. I had an opportunity to meet them and work with them in a cooperative fashion. And I thought maybe the best way to use my talents was to get involved in helping build Russia as part of the new, the new cooperative relationship. I was hired by H.J. Heinz. They make ketchup. People are familiar with their ketchup, but they also do food processing. And they were going to put a big food processing plant in Pyatigorsk in southern Russia. And I was going to be the plant manager to bring the skill set that I had perfected in Votkinsk at the missile factory, building this monitoring facility. I was going to do the same thing there. The coup came, unfortunately, in August of 1991, the coup against Gorbachev. Part 2 of the second title of my book, Disarmament at the Time of Perestroika, is Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union, because there's a direct relationship. But there was the coup happened, and H.J. Heinz got cold feet, pulled out of the project. So I was unemployed. And I was looking for jobs. I mean, if the phone hadn't rung when it did, I was probably going to be a New Mexico state trooper. So don't drive through New Mexico when Trooper Ritter's on duty because I'm going to pull you over. But that didn't happen. I got a phone call from a colonel who was my boss in Russia, and he had been sent to the United Nations because after the Gulf War ended, the decision was made that Iraq had to get rid of its weapons of mass destruction, the chemical weapons, the biological weapons, the nuclear weapons, and critically speaking, the ballistic missiles. And I was one of the people that was considered to be an expert on Iraqi ballistic missiles, and we had an accounting problem. Basically, the Iraqis were lying. They were lying about everything. And they were holding on to a number of missiles, a number of launchers, and they needed me to come in and create an intelligence unit that would break through the lies and empower inspectors to go into the ground and uncover the lies. And so I said, yes, I'll do that job. It's only supposed to be a 6-month job. Nobody thought these inspections would last longer than 6 months. It ended up being 7 years. And during that time, I turned this job into basically being, I'm not going to say director, that's too much, but I was the international intelligence officer. I traveled around the world. I met with senior intelligence officials from around the world to gather intelligence about how Iraq could be hiding weapons, what kind of weapons they could be hiding. One of the first assessments I wrote back in November of 1991 was that I believe the Iraqis were lying, that they were hiding about 100 missiles and about a half a dozen launchers. In March of 1992, confronted by our inspections, the Iraqis came clean. They were hiding about 100 missiles and about a half a dozen launchers. So I was pretty good on my stuff. But now they claim they blew them all up in the summer of 1991. They said that your inspections were on our, you were putting too much pressure on us. So we panicked and we blew everything up and we buried it underground and we just pretended not that it never happened. But now we've uncovered the lie, so they have to admit where it was. But now we have to forensically to pull things up and rebuild their inventory so that we can account for everything. We can't just take their word for it. They're liars. So we can't just say, oh yeah, we believe you. You blew it up, put it underground. We're done. We had to bring everything out from under the ground, reassemble it, and start to account for this stuff piece by piece by piece. And we did that. And that's something I'm pretty good at, is forensic investigations. It also became clear, though, that the Iraqis still weren't telling the truth. For instance, while they told the truth about ballistic missiles, they had underdeclared the chemical capability. They refused to declare biological warfare capability, and they refused to declare a nuclear capability. So we still had a lot of investigations to do. And piece by piece, we uncovered the lies. We confronted them with the lies. They ended up telling the truth. We carried out inspections to confirm that truth. And this is a process that was very controversial, very confrontational. There were numerous incidents with the Iraqis. Some of them got very serious. I had guns pointed in my face a number of times. And when we went into Iraq, we didn't carry weapons. Our only authority came from this ridiculous blue hat we had and a little passport that said, we're UN inspectors, and the authority given us by the Security Council, the promise that there would be backup. Well, in 1992, I helped lead an inspection to what was called the Ministry of Agriculture. We surrounded it because inside we believed was an archive of documents that would allow the Iraqis to rebuild their weapons of mass destruction programs. The intelligence was dead on. The archive was there. But what the Iraqis did is surround us and begin violent confrontation with demonstrators, throwing stuff at us, et cetera. Finally, somebody tried to stab an inspector, and we had to pull back because our job isn't to get in a fight with anybody. It's to do verification inspections. So we pulled back, and when we pulled back, they got the archive out. This went to the Security Council, and we all thought that that's it. Our job's over because they're going to go to war again. End this. Security Council did nothing. And that empowered and emboldened the Iraqis. And that was in 1992. So from 1992 onward, my philosophy was, now that we showed that we're cowards, the Iraqis will just be honest like a shark on blood. I said, we can never be cowards again. And I became the most aggressive person you'll ever want to meet. I wasn't violent because my job wasn't violence, but I got in their face. I didn't back down. You put a gun in my head, I pressed it in my hand. I said, pull the trigger. Pull it, you son of a bitch. Pull it. I did that on one occasion. I challenged them to blow my brains out. And they backed down. They backed down, not me. That's how I approached all my teams. I told them straight up, we're the alpha dogs. When we go into Iraq, we pee wherever we want to pee. We mark our territory. If they pee on top of it, we pee on top of it. Alpha dogs. We never back down. And we didn't. We pushed them and pushed them and pushed them, and we came very close to uncovering the whole truth. And the truth was supposed to be accounting for their weapons. Now, we needed 100% standard. That's what the Security Council said, 100%. By 1997, we had achieved about a 92, 95% certainty about what happened. And from me and others, we were saying, we think this is good enough, guys, because the stuff that we can't account for, you're never going to get. I already dug everything out of the ground there is to dig. Sometimes when a body gets buried, it just decomposes and there's nothing to find. And there's stuff we were not. Plus, what we're looking for degrades over time. So if you believe they're hiding it, and they started hiding it in 1991, by 1997, it's no longer viable. It's ridiculous to keep looking for something that no longer matters. But the United States wasn't interested in disarming Iraq. They were interested in getting rid of Saddam Hussein. In fact, they used the inspections as an excuse to keep economic sanctions in place against Iraq. Sanctions that, by the way, killed over 500,000 Iraqi children. If you remember the infamous statement by Madeleine Albright, when confronted with that, she said, that's a price we're willing to pay. Well, Madeleine, you didn't pay the price. The Iraqi people did. But and they also, in 1996, the CIA used my inspection team as a front to carry out a coup against Saddam Hussein. Now, under normal circumstances, the Iraqis had every right to take me, my team members, line up us against in the wall and shoot us. They didn't. But we lost a lot of trust and confidence on the part of the Iraqis. They always viewed us after that point as being an arm of the CIA trying to kill their president. And this is important when I'm trying to get into presidential palaces to confirm they're not hiding anything in there. So it's a messed up situation. But and that pretty much is why I resigned. My job was to carry out an investigation to an end that would hopefully lead to the lifting of sanctions and bringing this to an end. The United States didn't want me to accomplish my job. Quick story on how I really angered the U.S. In 1998, I was supposed to lead an inspection into Iraq in March that was supposed to trigger a war. When I say that, I mean I was at the White House briefing it, State Department, and we had a final meeting in the U.S. ambassador's office at the U.S. mission in New York. Bill Richardson was the ambassador at the time. And Richard Butler, who was the chief executive of the UN inspection team, got up and on a whiteboard, he said, Ritter, you got to go in, you got to do your inspection of this facility, which was the Ministry of Defense headquarters, which the Iraqis had said is a red line. If you go there, it's going to be war. We're never going to let you into the Ministry of Defense. Said so. And the U.S. said, well, you're going to the Ministry of Defense. So he said, you got to go to the Ministry of Defense on this day. We have to have a crisis. Get your team pulled out on this day so we can bombing on this day. I said, who's we? The UN doesn't bomb anybody. I'm a UN weapons inspector. Who's we? Well, the Americans. I said, but my job is to do an inspection, not to provoke a fight. He said, no, sure, but the Iraqis won't let you in. Boom, boom. I said, okay, we'll see. I went and did the inspection. Madeleine Albright tried to stop me from doing the inspection. A lot of people tried to stop me because they knew that I wasn't a client tool of the United States. But what I was a faithful servant of the Security Council mandate of disarmament, which the United States voted for. So I viewed myself as being the most faithful servant of the United States. I went to the site. We showed up. Sure enough, the Iraqis weren't going to let us in. And they had their senior people coming down saying, Ritter, what do you think you're doing? I said, I'm trying to inspect this building. They said, well, you can't. And I said, if I leave here, understand that as I leave, cruise missiles are coming in. It's all over. And you're going to die. You're going to die. You're going to die. I'm not threatening you. I'm just telling you what the reality is. And you guys know that. So you have a choice. Let me in on my terms. Remember, I'm the alpha dog. I pee higher than everybody. Let me in on my terms or you all die. That's just the way it's going to be. And they thought about it. And they came back and they said, okay, we'll let you in on your terms because we trust you. And you want to know why they trusted me? Leading up to this inspection, I spent 3 years going back and forth to Israel, getting Israeli intelligence about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. The Iraqis don't like the Israelis, but their intelligence had found out about this. And he asked me straight up, he said, how's Israel? I said, Israel's nice this time of year. He said, so, you travel there a lot. I said, well, the fact that you're asking me that question means that you know I do. So yes, I travel to Israel. Yes, they give me information. And yes, that information is used in the inspection. He said, he turned to the senior Iraqi guys, including their chief of staff and their minister of defense. He said something in Arabic was, this guy's honest. He's not lying. He's not going to lie. We should trust him and let him in. So I got in there. We spent many hours in the Ministry of Defense looking for everything we needed to look for. And there was nothing there related to our mandate. And we left. Madeleine Albright, meanwhile, was in Paris bragging to her French counterpart that any minute now she's going to get the phone call that's going to bring the missiles down on Iraq. And when she got the phone call, it wasn't the one she wanted. And from that moment on, the U.S. government hated my guts because I didn't give them the war they wanted. And by August, that was in March. By August, it was too much. They interfered with inspections. Basically, all they wanted me to do was create a crisis that could lead to a confrontation. So I resigned. I resigned in protest over U.S. interference in the work of the inspectors. I testified before the United States Senate. There's an infamous clip or famous clip, depending how you want, of Joe Biden and I having our little stare off as he chastises me for operating above my pay grade. This was above my pay grade. That's why they get the limos, you don't, Scotty boy, etc. But that set me on a path of, I guess, speaking truth to power. Initially, I focused primarily on the Iraq issue because that's the one that was most able to effectively be involved in. Later on, I got involved in talking about Iran's nuclear program. I'm a fervent believer that the Iranians are not pursuing a nuclear weapons program, that their nuclear program is for exclusively peaceful use. And then because of my background in Russia and disarmament, et cetera, I've been following the Russian situation. In 2010, 2009, 2010, I started writing for Energy Intelligence, which is the premier publishing arm of Energy Intelligence Group. They focus on energy security issues, and at the highest level, I mean, their clientele is all the major oil companies, all the major oil industry companies, and people of that nature. So you're writing for a very high graded person. And one of the areas that I focused on was Russian energy and the role that Russian energy played in global geopolitics. And so I felt that when this conflict came up, I actually predicted this conflict back in many years ago. And in December, I wrote an article for them that that was spot on. But I think what got me mainly involved in this is I forget who. I did a podcast with somebody. I can't remember. They called me up out of the blue because I was just writing the occasional article on Ukraine and Russia. And then somebody said, "Hey, could you come on and do this podcast?" And I did it, and I guess it went viral. And and from that moment on, people were just calling up saying, "Hey, can you be on this podcast? Be on this podcast? Be on this podcast?" And I do, and I'm comfortable talking about things that I feel competent to discuss. But I'm not out there marketing myself as as the expert on the Ukraine situation. For instance, I didn't call you to be on your show. You called me to be on your show, and I'm doing it because you made a request. And I feel like if you're going to talk about empowering people through knowledge and information, you can't walk away from a valid request to talk about that. But the last thing in the world I want to do, and this isn't any offense to you, but the last thing I want to do is be on a podcast. I would rather, at my age, be walking my dogs, reading books, drinking beer, watching football. That's what I would rather be doing. But life circumstances, dictate that maybe my task right now is to do something else.
Well, Scott, you said quite a lot there, and kind of I'll give you an opportunity to say something in just a minute. But I think there's actually a lot of questions that have been prompted over that, and I think the main one, the overarching one I see, is that you keep saying I pissed off the United States. The United States wanted this. What exactly determines America's military posture, and what was determining it in the 80s, and is that related to today? Because you said something important. You said Reagan said, there's no way the Soviets would think we're trying to bomb them. Why would they think that? And then when he got the info as to no, they really did, he acted on it. For my basic civics class here in New York City, now, the United States doesn't have the same education system it once had. But I learned that the president is the commander in chief, that he is the highest ranking person in the military, supposedly, right? And that's, what I graduated learning and thinking. Why is it the case that the president didn't know that when it was happening, only after the fact? So who is making the military posture, and what determines that?
Well, that is a very good question. I mean, at the end of the day, it always originates with civilian leadership. Franklin Delano Roosevelt authorized the Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project was a nuclear weapons project designed to create an atomic bomb that could either be used against Germany if the Germans went forward with a nuclear weapon, or after the war in Germany ended, against Japan for controversial reasons. Some people say it was to terminate the conflict. I believe it was to intimidate the Soviets. But we dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan. But by the time we dropped those weapons on Japan, Roosevelt was no longer president. He died, I think, in April 1945. He was replaced by Truman. Truman, who had not been in the loop with anything. So now we begin the process where, remember, our Constitution mandates civilian leadership of the military. But now we have a situation where a system is already in place. A president dies, a new president comes in, the system still exists. And the system is dictating reality to this president, who, while is in command, is intimidated by the fact that there's already this massive system in place with congressional support, military industry support, all the leaders are supporting it. And so oftentimes all the president can do is nod his head yes and sign where he's told to sign. That system grew under Truman because we used nuclear weapons. Truman continued the enterprise, and then we got involved in the Korean conflict. In the Korean conflict, the system, prior to the Korean conflict, the system produced something called the Long Telegram. George Kennan wrote it. He was a State Department official. Again, not an elected representative, part of the system. He writes this long telegram that then is used to define a posture of containment to the Soviet Union. So the system now uses Kennan's telegram to brief the president to get approval for imposing a system. It wasn't the president telling the system to do this. It was the system going to the president going, all right, I think that's a good idea. Let me sign it here and go on. Then Eisenhower became president. Eisenhower inherited the system. Eisenhower, being who he was, looked at the system and said, this is broke. This is broke. This is a system that lied to him about a bomber gap. They came screaming to him, Mr. President, we have a bomber gap. The Russians have more bombers than we do, and we have to build up our bomber capability. And so Eisenhower went, holy cow, okay, what do you need? Billions of dollars to build bombers. Here we go, billions of dollars. Meanwhile, the congressional military industry complex is sitting there going, we got lots of money. How do we do this? We need to build a factory in Texas because Lyndon Johnson wanted the factory in Texas. We got to build a factory in California, and we got to spread load this money to get as many people rich as possible off of this little scheme we've concocted here, a bomber gap. Then we came up with the missile gap. Oh my God, the Russians have missiles. We don't have missiles. Boom. Where do I sign? Here. Once again, how do we spread load, building missiles in the missile complex, putting missile places in states, money, 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 getting the loyalty of Congress attached to the establishment, because it's all about money. It has nothing to do with national security. It's all about money. And Eisenhower realized it, and that's why he gave his farewell address when he warned about the military-industrial complex. He warned America about it. He said, we are turning into something that is going to destroy democracy. This is not democratic. We're allowing this power base to be built up that exists only to build its own power. JFK came in, and it's interesting. You talk about Reagan's response. JFK went to the Pentagon, and he was briefed on what's called the single SIOP, the Single Integrated Operation Plan, SIOP. It was the nuclear war plan. And he walks into the Pentagon, and they brief him on the nuclear war plan. He goes, what the heck is this? You're telling me the only option I have is to destroy the world. And as he walked out, he turned to the guy that was with him, and he said, and we call ourselves the human race. I mean, he was shocked. And he went back and he said, you got to change this. This can't be allowed. And the system went, change it. Little here, came up to him. Still, the only option is to destroy the world. The system don't change. That's the problem. Presidents change. Kennedy got assassinated. Johnson came in. Johnson had the same reaction when he was briefed. Johnson resigned. Nixon came in. Nixon, madman Nixon. He thought that the war plan was crazy. Ford thought the war plan was crazy. Every president that's seen the war plan thinks it's insane, but the war plan continues. You can't stop the war plan. Literally, this is like out of a Dr. Strangelove type movie. We're in the war room. No fighting in the war room, but the war room's there, and the war room's never going away. And That's where we are today. To show you the power of this system, Barack Obama, who was supposed to be the great transformative president. I mean, he's coming in after one of the world's worst, ideologically constrained presidents, George W. Bush, who violated every treaty, withdrew from treaties, went to war illegally. And Obama, I'm the different guy. Didn't change a darn thing under Obama's administration. Nothing changed. Wars expanded. On the nuclear side, he said, we're going to walk away from this nuclear posture that George W. Bush implemented about the ability to carry out a preemptive nuclear strike. He said, no, we're going to go to single purpose, sole purpose doctrine. The sole purpose of America's nuclear enterprise is to deter people from launching a nuclear attack against us. That's it. 8 years of Obama, and he didn't change it. Why? You can't change it. Because the nuclear enterprise won't let you change it. Because the nuclear enterprise is about money and power, and you don't get to be president unless you have the money and the power backing you up. Joe Biden was vice president. Donald Trump came in and said, yeah, I don't do sole purpose. I do preemptive strike. We're going to hit you if you cyber attack us. Madman. Fire and fury, baby. I can use nuclear weapons wherever I want. I hope everybody thinks I'm crazy, and I'll do it. Biden went, that's stupid. I'm going to impose, first thing I'm going to do when I become president, sole purpose. He just published his national security strategy 2 years into his presidency. He's kept preemptive strike. Why? Establishment ain't going to let him change. That's the fact. So we talk about the U.S. government. We talk about civilian control of the military. Yes, theoretically, the president can give an order, and the order should be obeyed. Obama gave an order to close Gitmo. It's still open. You can give certain orders, but the establishment ain't going to follow through. That's just a statement of fact. They'll drag their feet. Trump said, get the troops out of Afghanistan by this date. Didn't happen. Trump said, reduce the number of troops in Syria. They increased the number of troops. Why? The establishment has a will and a mind of its own, and it doesn't like sharp deviation from the trajectory that they've been taking for decades. This is why it's very difficult to get the American ship of diplomacy and global interaction to change course. It's got this massive momentum, and it's very hard to get it to steer away. It's just going to keep going with all that momentum behind it, regardless of who's in power. I mean, we'd like to elect, smart people, but let's ask ourselves this. How do you get to be president? How do you get to be senator? You know this question. How hard was it for Diane Sayre, an eminently qualified person, a person of good moral character, intelligent? Why couldn't she be a viable candidate? Because she ain't from the system. Diane Sayers hasn't spent her life becoming ingrained in the system, of the system, and empowered by the money that comes with the system. To be the president of the United States, you have to come from within the system. If you don't, like Donald Trump, then you get attacked the entire time. You get attacked and you get ground down and you get beat. And Donald Trump was the system. He bragged about it. When people said, how about tax evasion, all that stuff? He said, I know it better than anybody. Why? Because I do it all the time. I am the system. I'm the system. Nobody knows the system better than me. So even Donald Trump, being an outsider, was really an insider. Anybody else who wants to be president has to come from the inside, which means it's not really civilian leadership of the system. It's the system leading itself. They pick who's going to be president. They pick who's going to be senator. They pick, for the most part, who's going to be in Congress. The system's broke.
Go ahead, Kynan. You can ask a question, but before you do, I just want to say I think you really exposed it right there. Donald Trump isn't the outsider people thought he was. He's an insider who came outside and said, look at the dirty stuff they're doing, because I do it too. Gets elected. Anyway, I'm going to go back in there, but, thanks for getting me in here. So go ahead, Kynan.
But we voted for him anyways.
Yeah, no, Scott, just a lot of stuff that you've said there. And yeah, it really is this Dr. Strangelove world we're living in. It's not just fantasy or fiction. It's something, as you said, that's reality. But my question is, if civilian leadership has failed over these years to actually control military policy to make it sane again, do you think there is a future where this could actually change, that we could actually have diplomacy with other nations without this military congressional complex actually interfering with things?
Well, the answer is yes, but it's going to be very hard. First thing that I believe going to have to change. You have to take the money out of politics. That means we need a reversal of Citizens United, and we need to get all special interest money out of politics. There needs to be a level playing field so that Diane Sayre type candidates compete on the same financial level as an establishment candidate like Chuck Schumer. I mean, you guys are part of that campaign. You know there was no comparison between the financial support she had, and I'm not denigrating her supporters. I'm just saying that you can't compare the finances that she had to work with, the finances that Chuck Schumer had to work with. And as long as money is a part of politics, we're going to get Chuck Schumers over Diane Sayre all the time. The first thing to do is take the money out. Then the next thing you have to do is you have to seize control of the political parties, because the political parties have nothing to do with democracy. They have everything to do with sustaining control of the establishment over who gets put on the ballot. I mean, I think the Democrats missed a moment in time when Hillary Clinton's loyalists at the DNC carried out their coup against Bernie Sanders in the summer of 2016. That was a moment where Bernie supporters should have seized control of the convention, fired everybody on the stage, declared a coup d'etat, and announced that Bernie Sanders was the Democratic candidate. Right then and there, purge, not violently. I'm not promoting violence. I'm saying, you know, you had the moral authority at that point in time to step in and say, the people have spoken. It ain't Hillary, it's Bernie. We're taking control. They didn't do that. The establishment dug in, and now we get Joe Biden. On the Republican side, it was an incomplete coup. You know, the outsider, Mr. Outsider Insider, Donald Trump, he did something that was spectacular. I mean, a lot of people don't give him credit for this. He went up against 17 of the Republicans, you know, most loyal establishment people, and he wiped the slate with them, cleaned them out, destroyed them. Nobody could stand toe to toe with him. At that point in time, his followers should have purged the Republican Party, but that scared the living you know what out of the establishment, because of course his followers are all MAGA, racist, murderers, thugs, you know, whatever you want to say about them, other than angry American people, which is what they really were. I'm not defending MAGA ideology. I'm not here saying, I'm not promoting, just like I'm not promoting Bernie ideology. There's a lot I don't agree with Bernie. There's a lot I don't agree with Trump. I'm saying, though, that people are fed up with being spoon-fed solutions from an establishment that doesn't care about them. And the Democrats had an opportunity, the Republicans had an opportunity, and they didn't do it. The revolution wasn't complete. And until there's a revolution that wipes the political party slate clean and we start over with people who aren't beholden to anybody about money or influence or power, people who select people because they best represent what we, the people, want and need. If we can do that, get those people into office, and we take away special interest money, there's a slim chance we can actually get the democracy we deserve and want and need. But if you don't do that, we're just going to get the democracy that the establishment's willing to give us, which isn't democracy, it's plutocracy.
Yeah, and just to kind of make the point on Diane Sayre, Chuck Schumer raised $40 million for his Senate campaign. Then the next person over, the Republican opponent, Joe Pinion, raised $400,000. And then Diane Sayre raised about $350,000. So if you think about it, the independent and the Republican couldn't even come up to $1 million. Yeah. And Chuck Schumer, who's supposedly a favorite, right, who's an establishment in New York, the most blue state, has to get $40 million to secure his seat.
Yeah.
So
again, the solution is that Diane Sayre, Pinion, and Schumer should have the same amount of money. That's it. Same amount of media access, same amount of money. It has to be a fair level slate. If you meet the bar, be put on the ballot, then the campaigns have to be equal. It should stop being about raising money. The fact is, I would prohibit anybody who makes the ballot from ever raising money. It's against the law for you to raise money. The federal government or the state government allocates a budget and says you all have the same budget, go forth and campaign as equals. That way the American people can decide who they want and who they don't want. They're not being spoon-fed or force-fed, or, you know, I think Diane was kept off the debate stage. The New York citizens didn't even get a chance to hear her. It's just insane what happened there. And trust me, what you guys saw happens in every state in the United States. It's the American democracy, and it's ugly as hell.
I think your military experience and your history, we would know a lot about election fraud, voter fraud, ballot stuffing.
Why?
I want to ask.
Why would I know about that from my military background? I did I did mail-in ballots my entire life. I had to submit a request for a ballot months in advance, provide proof of my military status, explain why I couldn't be at a polling station. Then they would mail me the ballot. I would have to fill it in and get it in on time for it to be counted. Um, that's my only experience. My first time standing in a polling place to vote for the president of the United States came well into my adult life. I always mailed in a ballot, but it was done in a way that doesn't even come close to, mimicking this mail-in ballot system today, which I just don't understand. But that's a different issue. I don't know anything
So I
about
want to.
ballots, so I just want to say that I'm not an expert on
Oh,
voter fraud because the elections that I participated in, I did my duty. And that's it. I didn't monitor anything. And if you're thinking about overseas, well, here's what I learned. Um, you know, the United States is supposed to be the world's preeminent democracy. I mean, we sell ourselves that way. We're the best. We're the best. Americans the best. We can't pick. We can't tell you who won the vote 4 days afterwards, a week afterwards. In these third world banana republic places where we send monitors in, same day results, same day results, same day. How do they do it? Why is that the case? And why can't we do it? Now, I'm not saying there's fraud going on in the United States, but what I am saying is if it takes that long, you create the perception that there could be fraud. You need to get the election results out quick so that the people who voted have confidence in the system. But we have the system that's just fundamentally broke. So every election I've seen, look, I watched democracy grow from inception in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, when I arrived in 1988, it started this democratic revolution, transitioning away from Communist Party's single control to a democratic system where the Russian people elected representatives to the people's the Congress of People's Deputies, and then they elected a Senate type thing called the Supreme Soviet. Then you had a president. That was what he's trying to build. I monitored, not in an official capacity, but as an interested foreigner. I was there at the polling place for the first elections in the Soviet Union. I watched it happen. I was present at inception and at conception. And I mean, it was literally one of the more emotional moments because you're just literally watching democracy give birth. And to look at how they did it and all that, there was no controversy. There was no ballot stuffing. It was a citizen showed up with documents, showed the documents to prove who they are. They signed in, they cast their vote, and then they walked out, and the results were determined that night. People sat there and counted the votes and came up with the tallies. They got everybody together. They did the numbers and said, this is the person who voted. Back then, they had this requirement that you had to have a plurality, not just a majority, but a plurality. So there was a runoff election. And there were actually two runoff elections to get a result. But it wasn't because of anybody's concern in how the election was run. It was just the nature of the way they did the election, where you had to have a distinct majority to win the seat. But it was a beautiful thing to watch. So even in communist Soviet Union, they ran a cleaner election than any American election I've ever seen.
You just busted some of my act there.
No, that's absolutely ridiculous. It's insane that, the United States today in the past has accused other countries of running, fraudulent elections. Yet look at our system today. There's this runoff going in Georgia. I mean, what kind of system are we running where we can't even find out who won, the same day of the election? It's absolutely mismanaged.
And look at the amount of money that they're funneling into Georgia. Why does democracy have to cost that much? How much does it cost the average American to go to the poll? Not much. Especially it would be cheap if you made it a national holiday. But imagine that, making it a national holiday so everybody can vote without worrying about anything. But no, we don't do that. But here's two candidates, Warnock and Walker. Everybody knows who they are, but it's going to come down to money. They're pouring in money, advertisement. Is that democracy? It's not democracy. It's something else, but it ain't democracy.
Yeah, the thing about the Soviet Union having cleaner elections than we do, because I think like many other Americans, kind of bought into this, there's corruption overseas, but not here, right? You always overhear about the CIA overthrowing this government or installing this puppet government here, ballot stuffing here. That's what I was referring to, which kind of leads into my next question. What does it necessarily mean to be a Marine intelligence officer? What is the difference between like Marine intelligence, Navy intelligence, Army intelligence, and then normal CIA, NSA intelligence?
Well, anytime you do military intelligence, you're providing intelligence support to a specific skill set. Marines are the amphibious force in readiness. So what does it mean to be a Marine intelligence officer? When I was there, what we called our intelligence officers were expeditionary intelligence officers, meaning that we were experts in supporting an expeditionary force with intelligence support. We had to be able to integrate with the national intelligence system, take data out of that, but we also had to have the ability to collect intelligence on our own. So we had to use the assets available to us, whether it be reconnaissance Marines, signals Marines, using attached units like Navy SEALs, aircraft using RF-4 aircraft, OV-10 aircraft, U-2. You learn about all the systems so you can put together a collection plan that meets the needs of the supported commander. So the commander will come up with his information needs, essential elements of information, what he needs to know to make a decision. He's basically asking questions. What's this? What's that? What's this? I have to take that question now and I have to parse that down into the individual information requirements. What do I need to know to answer that question? And once I break that down, then I have to take each one of those and say, how do I get that information? What do I have to do to get that information? I can get it using a database. I can get it by tasking an intelligence collection resource, et cetera. And so you send out all your taskers, that information comes in, and then you have to assess it. And sometimes the assessment's incomplete. You refine the questions and you send them back out. And eventually, I put together an assessment that I brief my commander that answers his questions. Then what happens is he asks new questions, and the cycle starts all over again. So if you're a Marine intelligence officer, you're doing that in support of your commander, whether at the battalion level, which gets very personal. In the artillery battalion, my job was to basically find targets so Marines could fire their artillery shells on targets in a timely fashion, and to understand the threat to us so that we could avoid being targeted. So it's like a giant game of combat whack-a-mole. We're trying to whack them, they're trying to whack us, we're moving, they're moving, and whoever can get inside the decision-making cycle, the OODA loop of the enemy, is going to win. And so the idea is to be able to do all that whole intelligence collection cycle quicker than your enemy can do. The Air Force has a different thing. They're doing an air war. In the Marine Corps, we had air. If I had been at the air wing, I'd be doing an air war too. It's all about fighter aircraft. What's the threat against the fighters? What's the radar look like? Can the airplanes fly through a gap in the radar that you identify? Or what's going to try and shoot them down? What altitudes they should be flying? Do we need jammers to come in and jam signals? That's what you do there. The CIA is the national level stuff. They do big world analysis because it's all customer driven. The CIA's customer is the President of the United States. The CIA's job is to do analysis that informs the President of the United States. And by extension, that means you're informing the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, everybody else. But your big thing in the CIA is to answer the president's questions. Remember, I said the commander asks questions, the president asks questions. But the other thing the CIA has to do is anticipate questions the president hasn't asked. You can't just sit there and pretend I got to wait for the president. So you have to keep the president informed about what's going on in the world. So that's why they have something called the Presidential Daily Briefing. The presidential daily briefing is a document the CIA puts together based upon the most pressing issues of the time that the CIA believes the president needs to be made aware of. Now, trust me, people say, that shows the CIA is trolling the president. You want to watch a presidential daily briefer get fired that quick? And want to watch a director of intelligence get fired? Fail to bring an issue up to the president that comes to his attention later. He's going to say, why wasn't I briefed on this? Why didn't you tell? So anybody who thinks that the CIA is just, spoon feeding him, no, the CIA is, they're scared to death. Then we get it all. Because we don't want a phone call coming in from the French president saying, what the hell's going on in Africa? And the president goes, CIA, what's going on in Africa? Well, last week, why didn't you brief me about this last week? You're fired. So the CIA has to do that. They also collect. And the thing that the CIA does better than any other group, allegedly, is human intelligence. That's their specialty. Their job is to recruit spies. So they have a whole system of case officers who are specially trained to go out and do human collection. They work out of embassies, they work undercover, and they collect that. The Defense Intelligence Agency does that, but their primary customer is the Secretary of Defense and the chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So they answer very military-focused questions. They have their own human intelligence capability. They go out and spy, but their focus is on the military, whereas the CIA focuses on the world. The military doesn't like the CIA to get involved in war fighting. So when it comes time to talk about trigger pulling, for instance, in the Gulf War when I was there, we had two in the headquarters there in Riyadh. We had something called the Giles, which was they called the Joint Intelligence Liaison Element, but that's the CIA. It's a CIA team that's put together to provide direct support, so that if we have a question at the headquarters, they can go back to CIA and get the answer. But the Defense Intelligence has something called DIALS, and Defense Intelligence Liaison Element. They had their own guy, and they were plugged into the DIA doing that Defense Intelligence Agency. They didn't like the CIA getting involved in decisions about pulling triggers. Pulling triggers is the military thing. So there's competition going on there. Then on top of them, we have something called the National Security Agency. And these guys, they basically cover anything dealing with communications, electronic signals, things of that nature. They're the cyber guys. They're the guys who listen to phone calls. And they just go around, they suck everything up in the world, and then it goes into a bubble, because this is considered to be the most classified stuff in the world. And it goes into a bubble, and each one of these military intelligence groups has liaisons in the NSA whose job is to review that intelligence and see that which is necessary to support. So back to me being a Marine intelligence officer, I would send requests to NSA and say, do you have anything about this? And it would go to my liaison there, who would then go to the NSA and they say, do you have anything about this? And they say, yes, but he doesn't have a need to know. So the answer is no. And then they go, no. And because some of the stuff is so top secret. And you do the same thing with imagery. We have spy satellites. We have U-2 aircraft. Back then we had SR-71 aircraft. I would send in a request for imagery. I would say, I need this target image during this period of time. And then they would do all that. And I'd get the imagery. But the bottom line is, the Marine Corps was unique because we had what was called an expeditionary intelligence officer. Me. And I did everything. The Air Force had specialties. They had an imagery intelligence officer. They had this specialty. The Army had specialists. So whenever I went and talked with my Army or Air Force or Navy counterparts, I was dealing with specialists. And it was somewhat intimidating because they were really experts in that specialty that they had. But they couldn't operate outside of that. Whereas I operated totally outside of it. I could do anything. You could plug me in here, plug me in there, because the Marine Corps is so small. So I think we actually had the best intelligence officers of the entire military, because our intelligence officers, when I was in, were responsible for knowing everything. Masters of everything. A jack of all trades, master of none, unfortunately, but we could do everything. Unfortunately, the Marine Corps has changed. We now have specialty officers. We have a ground intelligence officer, an air intelligence officer, human intelligence officer. So we've gone the way of the other services. But above all, at the end of the day, an intelligence officer is an analyst, a highly trained analyst. And this is where my history training came in, because being able to do historical research, to go through archives and stuff, and then assimilate this data and write a paper about it. Because that's what an intelligence officer does. You're doing research. You're researching assimilating data and writing an assessment. It's like a term paper, and you send it up to your professor, your customer, and they feed it back. I loved it. I really did love it. There's certain aspects of it I didn't like. Human intelligence can, it gets ugly, because you're asking someone to betray their country, and how do you get them to do that? Exploiting weaknesses and frailties, etc. And it's a hard business because you have to answer the question you've been asked. And sometimes the questions are tough questions that ask you to delve into topics that aren't necessarily, all warm and fuzzy topics. You are responsive to the needs of the customer, and that's it. But I hope I answered the question. Maybe I just created more confusion than anything else.
Well, if you did, that'd be a good thing, because more questions is always a good thing, in my opinion. But I think you did. I have two more questions, but before I hit you with them, Kyan, do you have anything?
Yeah, but
You want to
why
follow?
don't you why don't you start? Why don't you go ahead with yours?
Okay, I have one question, and then I have a concluding question. So you can go after I ask this next one. Um, let's talk about the orchestration that exists right now between the intelligence agencies and the army with what's going on in Ukraine right now. Because, on the one hand, you have what's going on in the battlefield. We're getting reports that there are American boots on the ground, generals and stuff, who might have to have taken over some of the leadership in the Ukrainian army because those guys are just getting blown up. And then you have the propaganda stuff at home, the controlling of social media, the flow of information, articles, newspapers and stuff, right? So from what I would assume, and please correct me, this, why I'm posing this, like, is it the case that you have this kind of like coordinated holding hands, like, yep, CIA, NSA, and military are all laser focused on making sure that people at home support this war and making sure that the Ukrainians overall win?
Back when I was in, we were actually prohibited by law from doing anything like this. I mean, the idea that I, as an intelligence officer, would be involved in shaping the perception of an American citizen, it's just mind-boggling because it's illegal. It was illegal. I don't know what goes on after 9/11, and I don't know what goes on now today, what new laws have been passed that none of us know about. But that just be unthinkable. My job was to inform my customer, and that's it. I was not to be involved in any aspect of shaping information for public release. That's what a public affairs officer did. And we were prohibited from carrying out psychological warfare operations against the American target. Yes, in the military, we do have the ability to do exactly what you said to a hostile target. From the Marine Corps perspective, let's say we went to war in Iran, and we occupied Chabahar, Bandar Abbas as port cities, and we're pushing in. I may be put in charge of a psychological warfare operation that's designed to win the hearts and minds of the Iranian people there, to get them so that they aren't blowing up our trucks, so that they at least are passive observers to what we're doing, not opposing us, to try and win over, to try and convince them to identify hostile elements and all that. So there's going to be a psychological warfare element there where I'm convincing them of how bad their government is, how good our government is. But that's part of war. That's civil affairs combined with psychological warfare. Totally legal. But what I can't do is take that same skill set and come to the United States and do that against American citizens. That was illegal. But that's not the case today. Today we have this notion that free speech is somehow empowering disinformation, and disinformation is undermining democracy. What stupidity is that? Democracy is empowered by free speech, and free speech is whatever the hell the proponents of free speech want it to be. I mean, I always thought that if you had a good idea and you can articulate the good idea and intelligent people listen to you, that you could win over people through the strength of your argument. But I also always felt that if you stood up on a podium and you spewed nonsense, that most people would go, that's nonsense, and they would walk away. But the answer isn't to shut the person up on the podium. The answer is to make sure that everybody possible can hear the person on the podium and make their own decision about, do they want to believe that or not. You have to trust the American people. We don't trust the American people nowadays. Why? because the intelligence community has admitted, hasn't, see, I would have gone to jail if I had done this. If I had taken information and, well, give you an example. Um, when I was at the UN, we were involved in this huge propaganda war with the Iraqis, where they were trying to portray us as, CIA agents, and we were doing this, that, and the other thing. A lot of what they were saying was actually true, not because I was, but because people were using my team. But we had to counter that by showing that the Iraqis were liars, cheaters, etc. I I was asked to. We had a lot of intelligence. Like I said, I traveled around the world and I got intelligence from everybody, and I had a file. But a lot of intelligence, believe it or not, is just dull, boring nonsense. You open up a file and it says something, but there's no action. There's nothing you can act on. There's no piece of information I can say, aha, let's check on this. Let's pursue that. Let's investigate this spot looking for this. It's just this generic, Saddam Hussein loves donkeys. Can't do much with that one. But so I had a file full of this stuff. And the British came and they said, we would like you to give us some of the intelligence that you have that puts the Iraqis in a bad light, but you can't act on it as an inspector. And I went to my boss and I said, this is what they want. He said, sure. So we ended up doing something called Operation Mass Appeal. And I would travel to London with this information, and then the British would take it and they would plant it in newspapers around the world. And then like India would then run a story, or Poland would run a story. And I was very leery of this because I said, well, okay, but don't plant it in an American newspaper because I can't be involved in that. And I was told by my American counterparts, I'm no longer in the intelligence business. Officially, I'm a UN employee, so don't worry about that. It's none of my business what happens to this information. And I've always had a little bit of a problem with that whole thing. I know why we did it. I know the pressures we were on to try and counter what the Iraqis are trying to do. But if you have to stoop to their level to beat them, then is it really a fight worth winning? That might be a naive statement on the part of of course you have to win. You have to do whatever is necessary to win, not by compromising yourself. And I feel like my involvement there was a little bit compromised, which is why I talked about it. I'm very honest about it because, I don't pretend to have been perfect. I've made mistakes. I've made mistakes like everybody else. And I think that was one of my mistakes, to allow myself to be sucked into that business of spreading disinformation in an effort to create a perception. But the US government is doing that today. They've acknowledged it. They admit it. They brag about it. They brag about declassifying intelligence information and then leaking it to mainstream media outlets for the purpose of them playing it as if it's the truth in order to shape perception on the part of the American public. This is just wrong. This is illegal, or at least it used to be illegal. It should be illegal. And the American public should reject it, because now we can't trust anything we get from mainstream media, especially about the issue in Iraq, because as soon as they say anonymous US government source, or if they say anything, how do we know it's true? It used to be that you could trust your government to tell you the right thing. Not anymore. The government's in the business of lying to you. And I know people are going to say the government's always in the business of lying to us. Maybe. But when I first went in and did my Marine thing, I was naive. I actually believed that the US government was trying to do the right thing, wanted to do the right thing, was telling the truth. Why? Because I was told to always tell the truth. And so I just assume that the government's telling me this, that's the standard they're using for everybody. Apparently not. But we can't trust anything today, nothing. And nothing that we're told is the truth. What's going on in Ukraine from an intelligence perspective? Understand that we're in the business of making Ukrainians look good. So right off the start, we need to know that the CIA has been involved in Ukraine from the very beginning. And when I say the very beginning, I mean 1945, when we started backing something called the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists, with a guy named Stepan Bandera, whose job was to murder Russians, murder Poles, murder Jews. That's what he did. We liked him because he murdered Russians. We thought that was cool. Stepan Bandera got beat, went into exile. He was so bad that even the CIA said, this guy is bad. He's a bad dude, and not in a good way. It's not like Samuel Jackson bad. You're a bad mother. No, not that kind of bad. This is, you're evil. You're an evil guy. And But we continue to support his group. Even here in the United States, we have Banderas that live in Ellenville, New York. Um, and they worship this guy. They parade in his honor. They indoctrinate children and in his odious ideology. We supported them financially from 1945 up until 1990, and then the CIA never lets their hooks. We controlled them indirectly and direct financing from that point on. We mobilized them in 2014 to carry out the Maidan coup, and we've been working with them and the Ukrainian intelligence services to create the perception that Russia is bad, Ukraine is good. And we do, to show you this, Zelensky made a statement early on. I don't need a ride because people say, hey, we can get you out of Ukraine, get you into Miami, you can live in your little thing. I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. Boy, that went viral. Everybody, Zelensky's a hell of a guy. Look at him. I don't need a ride. I don't need. That's what he never said it. Never said it. Probably never even thought it. If you go to the original source, it says an unnamed intelligence official at the U.S. Embassy said this, and now the U.S. government.
I thought Zelensky said that. Wow.
Nope,
yeah.
Nope,
You
nope.
blew my mind.
Well, they've come out right now. The official narrative is he didn't say it. He said it. So at least we're admitting that he didn't say it. Same thing with Snake Island. 13 brave Ukrainian soldiers giving the finger to the Russian ship, and they all died a glorious death. And they made stamps and they did this. There were 82 of them. None of them died. They all surrendered. They're all taken into custody by the Russians, and they were treated well before being repatriated back. That's the truth. The coast of Kiev, this pilot that was running around shooting down everything that moved, man. I mean, this was awesome. He never existed, never happened. All this stuff was being cranked out by this propaganda machine. Now, that seems harmless because we sit here and laugh about, oh, those are silly stories. Bucha. Bucha is where they murdered, they being the Ukrainians, murdered scores of Ukrainian civilians. And then they tried to blame it on the Russians. They manufactured phone calls. They may have manufactured satellite imagery. We know that they're lying because there's enough evidence to convict anybody on circumstantial evidence. We have a Ukrainian politician telling everybody to stay indoors because a cleansing operation is underway. We have the Ukrainian security services saying the cleansing operation includes liquidating saboteurs and collaborators, meaning anybody who was deemed to be working with the Russians. And then, of course, we have the videotape where a notorious Ukrainian neo-Nazi is ordering his troops to shoot anybody that doesn't have any civilian that doesn't have the Ukrainian identifying band on their shoulder. Right there, there's no evidence that the Russians did this, but this is the narrative that is put out. A missile fell on a train station in Kramatorsk. It was a Ukrainian missile. Immediately became a Russian missile. It never happened. It wasn't Russia, but the spin. On and on and on, up into the most recent thing where we got a missile, a Ukrainian surface-to-air missile landing in Poland, killing 2 farmers. But the first thing out is it was a Russian attack. A Russian attack. They're running with it. Well, some lies can't be sustained. This one fell apart early. But even now, even though everybody knows the truth, NATO's talking about holding emergency meetings so they can put a no-fly zone in, all this kind of stuff. No one's being told the truth. The intelligence services have, they provide valuable intelligence to Ukrainians. Let's make it clear. The Ukrainians wouldn't have been able to achieve the victories they achieved in September without American intelligence support. We provided the knowledge of where the Russian lines were weak, where the Russians had insufficient forces. We provided real-time intelligence support to enable them to target Russian command and control logistics centers using the arms that we provided. So we gave the Ukrainians the kind of intelligence support that we give our own armed forces, and they were able to act on it with some success. But in addition to that, we lie about everything, about this war, about casualties, about who's winning. We lie about the Russians. We lie about everything about the Russians. If you go on, I mean, every time I log in, I use AOL. I know, boo, Scott, you're old. Yeah, I am old. But when I log into AOL, I'm immediately flooded with stories. Russian troops are committing suicide in massive numbers. Russian generals are all heroin addicts. Russian prostitutes are hanging around Vladimir Putin, waiting for him to die of cancer. On and on and on and on and on and on and on. Well, we've seen this before. Christopher Steele and the Dodgy dossier was nothing but manufactured intelligence. We're getting it all the time, every time. You turn on CNN, you turn on MSNBC, any news outlet. It's lies, 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 nothing but lies. And that's unfortunately what our intelligence services are doing. They're lying to the American public about the conflict in Ukraine. And who knows, maybe this Republican-controlled Congress will ask some questions that should have been asked a long time ago, not only about how money was spent, but about what the heck is actually going on the ground in Ukraine.
I know we're coming close to time, so go ahead, Kynan.
Yeah, you actually answered some of the questions I was going to ask.
I'm an intelligence officer. That's my job.
Exactly. Well, I think I have two questions for you. One was on your Twitter banning, which had to do with what you published on the Bucha and the Kramatorsk train station. And, you know, everyone's been raving since, you know, Musk was is now owning Twitter. I wonder if, you know, any progress has been made to repeal your ban ever since he became CEO. And my second question, it has to do with the Kherson, the recent Kherson move, which I'm sure people have asked you a million times already. But what's your analysis of the situation? Because, you know, the media says that this was a big win for Ukraine, while Russia has a different narrative on that. So I would ask, those are my two questions.
Okay, well, on Twitter ban, I mean, you accurately reflected it. I was banned because of some tweets I put out about Bucha. Tweets were based upon published works that I put out about Bucha, which were based upon some of the facts that I talked about. I didn't make anything up. I just reported the facts and said, take a look at the facts. This is the direction they lead you. But that was counter to the approved narrative. I was banned from Twitter. When Musk came on, I felt that maybe there was new leadership because the bird was free. Remember, bird was free, man, flying free. I said, okay, if the bird's flying free, then I'm going to violate Twitter rules and make a new account because I still have this alpha dog mentality. I don't have to ask permission to exercise free speech. People are like, well, go ask Musk to get your account back. No, Musk, give me my account back. I don't have to ask you. You're not, you don't control free speech. If you're the absolutist, free speech absolutist you claim you are, just unban the accounts and then be honest about what the rules are. But I'm not going to ask. So I created my own account, which is a violation of Twitter rules. But I was straight up about it in the bio thing. I said, this account is an open violation of Twitter rules because you guys suck. And I tested them. I said, oh, really? You're free? No content moderation? I said, Bucha was a war crime. Ukraine did it. Test. Ban. I got banned again. So they had me on read only mode on Twitter, and I recently just because when I go to it, it's after careful review, we determined that your account violated the rules. If you think we got this wrong, you can submit an appeal. So I submitted an appeal last night, actually another appeal, and I said you got it wrong. And I said, if you guys are going to be what you claim to be, proponents of free speech, then unban my account and be transparent about what your rules are going forward. I'm pretty sure they're going to ignore that, just like they ignore everything. Now on Kherson, let's be clear. Ukraine got a nice propaganda victory out of Kherson. Kherson was this bridgehead held by about 30,000 Russian troops, had 100 and some odd thousand pro-Russian civilians living there. And the Ukraine's been using this, the American weaponry they've been given, HIMARS, M777s, and such, to blow up bridges and interdict logistical lines of communication. Not totally, the Russians were still there, but the Russians were looking at it saying, we in the month of October we've defeated everything the Ukrainians threw at us. We inflicted 12,000 casualties on the Ukrainians, but we suffered about 1,500. And now we're looking at this situation, and it's becoming more and more difficult to support our troops with the artillery they need, the ammunition they need, et cetera. And we could be looking at a situation where if we decide to hold this land, we could lose another 3,000 troops. For what purpose? What value does this land bring? Is it worth 3,000 dead? Plus, there's a dam upriver that if the Ukrainians blew it up, would send a wall of water down that would not only kill a bunch of people, including civilians, but put whatever Russian troops are on the wrong side of the river at risk. They said, why don't we just nip this thing in the bud? Why don't we get rid of all the problems? First thing we're going to do is evacuate all the civilians. They put the word out. Anybody who wants to come with us, come with us. It took about a month to do this. They got over 150,000 people out of there. That's something the Russians never get credit for, actually caring about civilian casualties. They evacuate. When was the last time Ukraine evacuated a city before it went to war? No, the Ukrainians use human shields. The Russians don't. They evacuated them, and then they evacuated their troops. So Ukraine got this piece of territory that, while it's good for propaganda purposes, doesn't change anything. It strengthens the Russians. What people need to realize is that the Russians right now are in the business of buying time and holding a position till what? Until 200,000 troops show up next month that have been organized in the 10 to 15 division. Remember that 300,000 partial mobilization? Well, 87,000 have already been sent to the front lines to fill in the gaps. The rest of them are still finishing their training into combat units, and they're going to show up next month. 200,000. 200,000. And that's when we get to talk about who's winning this war and who's not, because I have a funny feeling when 200,000 Russian troops show up, fully armed, fully equipped, ready to fight, and the Ukrainians have burned all their forces out on these failed offenses, 12,000 guys here, 20,000 guys here, 20,000 guys here. They got nothing left. I'm pretty sure it's going to change the narrative. We'll see, but I'm confident that Russia is going to be in the driver's seat going forward.
Well, perfect. Scott, we're coming up on time, so where can people find you?
Well, I have consolidated everything I do into one-stop shop, maybe. Intelligence officers don't necessarily speak very well. But ScottRitterExtra.com is the domain. And if you go there, I post everything I publish in various forums. Podcast, for instance, if you send me a link to this, that'll go up there so everybody can get it. It's all open access. There's no paywall. If people want to donate, can, but it's not a requirement. But I put everything up on ScottRitterExtra.com, and that's it. I guess that I answered that question. I answered the customer's question.
Would people be able to find your book there as well, or where else?
Yes, on ScottRitterExtra.com, there is a link to the book. You can also go to the publisher at ClarityPress.com. You can buy it direct from the publisher, and you can get it from Amazon and Barnes and Nobles and other online outlets like that. And if I do book events on occasion, so if I do one in your neck of the woods, feel free to come. You can listen to me babble.
Sure.
And buy a book and I'll sign it.
And do you have a Telegram? Because I follow a Scott Ritter.
I do have a Telegram. Yeah. Telegram. It's
okay. That is you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, you got to be careful.
You.
Yeah. My Telegram is well. I mean, people copy it. Apparently, I'm very popular on Telegram. There's actually a Scott Ritter channel that isn't mine, but it has like 500,000 followers. I wish I was that popular.
Okay, now you got the 81,000 subscribers.
Yes, I'm the moderate. I'm the modestly followed account. Yes, with my Top Gun Maverick pose.
Got it.
I put that picture up there when the new Maverick movie came out. I was like, yeah.
All right. Well, listen, Scott, this was a lot of fun. I want to thank you. There were actually a lot more questions that we wanted to ask, but maybe we'll have you on again in the future. If you'd like to come back on. One of the questions I was going to ask was, if you were in power, I don't know if you were part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, how would you change the next 10 years of the military trajectory, for the good? How would you encourage, what would you want the military to be like so where you could encourage, 18 to 24-year-olds to want to enlist and not do what the military is doing now? That's a further discussion.
Well, I'm going to have to think on that one long and hard, but that means I have to come back to answer that question.
All right, good. Well, then that sounds good. So with that, thanks, Scott.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Keenan. Jose. Thanks a lot, guys.